Trudeau, Rhonda Vincent, Matt Leahy, Karen Dumas.
They work at Momentous Institute, and we work.
We don't work here.
They work at Momentous Institute, and that's where we go to school.
Best introduction ever. How was this morning, everyone? Daniel Pink, Sir Ken Robinson, Michael Sorrell. I can't think of much that would be more intimidating than following them, except perhaps speaking to 1,400 people. So I have to say, as the registration went up, first we sold out of one room and kept going. As speakers, we were like, oh, 1,400, yeah, great. So before we begin, I wanted to ask for a volunteer on the front row. Sarah. Oh, Sarah Cotton Nelson, everyone. Thank you. Give her a round of applause. So, Sarah, in the event that any of us pass out from nerves or can't finish, will finish the presentation for us. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. It's incredibly generous. On a serious note, we're going to talk about a serious issue. So, we're going to be talking about trauma and the impact of trauma on children. I want to fully disclose at the beginning, some of the content is difficult. Some of the stories will be painful to hear. But I also want to point out that they all have hopeful resolutions where we get to see restoration and healing. And so I want to begin by anchoring this presentation in hope. I want to invite each of you throughout the stories to breathe deeply. We can practice right now. Just like we have our children breathe deeply in order to ground yourself. And I just want to invite you to open your hearts and minds to whatever it is you're supposed to hear and you're supposed to take away today. So I'm going to start by unpacking different forms of trauma. And I know I'm preaching to the choir for so many. But it was really important for us to get everyone on the same playing field. So trauma can be acute. It can be witnessing or experiencing an act of violence. It can be losing a loved one. It can be a catastrophic event. Where we're going to spend the majority of our time is talking about chronic trauma. And so chronic trauma can be things like perpetually experiencing abuse or neglect, living in poverty, and what it means to always be hungry and never have enough food, or living with a substance abuser and constantly being exposed to erratic behavior. Now, something that's really important is we can't take how we as adults experience trauma and just impose that onto children. It's not how it works. Children have vastly different experiences of trauma. And so this is predominantly because they do not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. So for us as adults, when we experience something, we can take that scenario and plug it into a broader context. Then we can use all of that information to drive logical decision making. Children don't have this. So the reality for children or how they experience trauma generally falls out in two ways. One, the world is utter chaos, and at any time bad things can happen. How many adults in here are comfortable with that reality? That's a tough reality. It's really hard, even though it's the truth, that we have minimal control over what happens in our lives. For children, it's nearly impossible. So the alternate to that reality is bad things happen because I'm bad. So if I'm hit, it's because I deserved it. If I'm hungry, it's because I should have never been born so my siblings can have food to eat. Either way, what happens for children is that they exist on a daily basis in a hypervigilance to what's going on around me, heightened state of reactivity. And so whether it's I have to be on guard because I have to defend myself, I have to protect myself from harm, or it's I have to always be looking. What is your look telling me about how I'm doing? Or is your look telling me I'm performing the way I need to, I'm behaving the way I need to, so that I can have an imagined control over my circumstances? And I say imagine because it's not control, but it actually gives them hope because I can change the trajectory of what's going to happen to me. Both of those situations have a really significant impact on physiologically what's happening in our bodies. We tend to say, my heart hurts when something heavy is happening. And that's because we feel anxiety in our chest, right? With our breathing. Everything that's happening, though, is happening in the brain. So we talked about the prefrontal cortex. But what's happening, or what portion of the brain that's being activated in this circumstance, is the amygdala. The amygdala is incredibly important. Just to draw an example, if you've driven, particularly if you've driven in Dallas, someone has almost hit you. It's true, right? And so the amygdala is what is going to protect us in that instance. So a car is coming up and screeching at us, and we're able to almost slow down in time, where our heart rate goes up and our breathing goes up and our reflexes are cued, and we hit the brake and we avert the crash. Thank you, amygdala. You function the way you were supposed to. But for children who are constantly having to be on guard to protect themselves, the amygdala is always in action. So children, not always, but can be in that heightened state of reactivity 24/7. And we want them to take tests. And just like Sir Ken, I have such a deep respect for all educators that serve children in this way. It's the system, it's a systematic issue, but we also have to put on the question mark of, is it trauma? So just to draw a picture, I would like for you to either close your eyes or think back to the most recent time you experienced something traumatic. You got the dreaded 3 a.m. phone call, someone had passed away, you got a very difficult diagnosis, or someone you love was in a car crash. What was it like the first day you went back to work? Could you function the way you normally could? More than likely, you had to disassociate to some degree. That's a completely normal reaction. So either you drew within and you didn't really hear anything that was going on in the conversation, or alternatively, you over-communicated, but you still had no idea what was happening around you. Again, that's a completely normal response to trauma. But what if your boss walked up to you and said, I need you to take a test. And how you test is going to dictate how our agency is viewed. How would you perform? I wouldn't perform well. And so this is a circumstance that our children are facing every day. So now that I've talked about impact of trauma, let's talk about prevalence. So how often does this happen? The CDC and Kaiser Permanente conducted the largest study of its kind. I'm sure many, many people in this room have heard it, if not all of you. It was the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. In this study, 17,000 participants participated and shared information about their current health, mental and physical, as well as what their childhood experiences were like. So adverse childhood experiences, if you're not familiar with the study, are the big ones. The big ones that will likely shift the trajectory of your life. Abuse, neglect, having a parent that's a substance abuser or attempted to take their life, having a parent in jail. There are 10 of them. Of the 17,000 participants, irregardless of sociodemographic background, 25% had an ACE, or an adverse childhood experience. 10% had 5, irregardless of sociodemographics. So it's safe to say that each of you can think about the child population you serve and put those statistics, lay them over, and you start to see that we are encountering children who are living in toxic stress literally every day. The long-term implications of that study were that without intervention, children that experience ACEs are more likely to suffer from a variety of chronic conditions, so cancer, heart disease, stroke, and on and on. So I said that I was going to anchor the presentation in hope, and then I gave you a ton of really distressing statistics. But that's not where the hope lies. That's the painting of the picture. The hope lies in what you're about to hear. The hope lies in all the stories and the capacity of the human spirit to overcome and to learn from those experiences and give back. And it lies in effective interventions that we know work. It's like Sir Ken said, we have the answer. And so I promise you, within the next hour, we will wrap up and you will walk away feeling hopeful, and we hope that you have a couple of nuggets that you can take back with you. At this point, I'd like to bring up my colleague, Rhonda Vincent.
Hi. I'm going to talk to you about the trauma of poverty. Now, poverty is a huge topic, and so we're going to narrow the focus just a little bit so that we're talking about, let me get to the right, there we go. So that we're talking about poverty in a context that lots of us know well, the school. Today we're going to talk about how poverty impacts the success of kids in school. Now, childhood poverty is nothing new. In our country alone, 2,700 babies will be born today in poverty. And by midnight tomorrow, another 2,700 will join that group. Kids have always been overrepresented whenever we stop to count the poor. But what is new is our job market. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that by 2018, by 2018, high school dropouts will qualify for only 10% of every new available job. And if that high school dropout happens to be one of those 2,700 babies born poor, the job market all but guarantees that he'll remain poor for the rest of his life. And what about those kids, though, who hang on and get their high school diploma, but they can't quite tackle college-level work? Well, they're going to struggle as well, qualifying for only 30% of all available new jobs, 10% of which we know they already have built-in competition for. And so the big change, and it's been coming for a very long time, is that a formal education is no longer just a good idea. It is literally the bridge between poor and non-poor. And poverty is such a huge stumbling block, getting in the way of the academic and social skills that kids have to do well in school. So what is it about poverty that so completely derails a child's potential? Well, to answer that question, the best place to start is to look at what stress does to the brain. Now, stress is a really weird thing. A little bit of stress is actually good for you. When the body's under stress, the brain releases a hormone called cortisol. Now, cortisol, when it's released every now and again and in small squirts, does some positive things for your brain. It can excite you, it can energize you, motivate you, really make you sharper. But in a chronically stressed brain, the kind of stress that comes from poverty, the cortisol tap is always on, essentially bathing the brain in a constant, steady drip of stress hormone. Now, this is like poison to the brain, especially to the developing brain of a child. What happens in a chronically stressed brain is that the energy that should be used to make connections for learning is actually rerouted to the part of the brain devoted to survival. We call this part of the brain the emotional center, or the amygdala, which Jess already talked about. In the brains of chronically stressed kids, the neurons in the amygdala become overly sensitive, giving these kids hair trigger access to emotional memories. So the behavior of poor kids is often a default response to a time in which he felt angry or scared or threatened or abandoned. So it was no real shock to me that just a couple of weeks ago I was talking to a group of elementary school teachers, just 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers. And they were telling me, Rhonda, we're so struggling with students who they'll break out into fistfights over almost anything. They frequently shut down and just refuse to work. And some of them were telling me about kids who just run out of the classroom door. These behaviors are evidence of brains that are literally marinating in cortisol. These are brains that are wired so that during times of stress, they default to one of our 3 response mechanisms. We either fight, we freeze, or we flee. I want you to look at this image right here, and this graph shows the difference in the effect size if you compare the brains of poor 5-year-olds and their middle-class peers. And what you can see is that there are very large differences in the brain, particularly in areas related to language, memory, impulse control, and visual spatial skills. So poor kids come to our schools doubly disadvantaged. It's not just that they can't afford the backpacks and the construction paper. It's that they're coming into our classrooms with underdeveloped cognition that they're going to need to pay attention, to concentrate, to process and remember information. Research tells us that by kindergarten, day 1 of education, most poor children are a full year behind their peers in reading and math skills. And 9 years later, that gap widens from 1/2 to 2/3, proving out that old adage that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. We teachers, and I am a teacher, we teachers are often the first ones, and sometimes we're the loudest, to say, hey, we've got to have parental involvement. We can't do this alone. So let's, I think it's a valid comment, so let's take a step back from the child's level and really start to look at the family. I think we'd all like to believe that every family is able to rally around its kids, that the adults and the extended family members could reach out and together weave a web of love and care that would shield their children from this type of chronic stress. But the reality is that poor parents who often go it alone are suffering the same kind of chronic stress as their kids. The reality is that when there's never enough and there's no hope in sight, that when despair and depression chase you every single day, even the most loving parent is going to find it difficult to provide the safe, stable, and emotionally warm environment that would really provide a buffer for her child from this trauma of poverty. And the problem with the family really starts before the baby is even born. Poor children who are often born premature and without prenatal care are 3 times as likely to be high-need infants. And the double whammy for these kids is that poor parents who are disproportionately young, often lacking in experience and support, find it more difficult to meet the demands of a high-need child, often resorting to withdrawal of affection or physical punishment just to control a child's behavior. And remember, this is directed at children whose brains are becoming fine-tuned to feelings of abandonment and threat. So let's give the parents a little bit of break and just look around the house. Overcrowding is a very common condition in poor families. And because they struggle to pay bills, often the utilities are cut over and over. And when you're not sure if your refrigerator or your stove is going to work, it fuels already intense challenges like food insecurity. Poor families move twice as often as other families. And these aren't the kind of moves like my family has made. Moves to go to a nicer house or get closer to a better job. These are moves to take advantage of a free month's rent at an apartment complex, even if it's clear across town. Or a move to avoid a landlord who's angry because your rent is late again. In fact, poor families are evicted 5 times as often as other families. Unfortunately, the news isn't much better once we step outside the door. There we go. There are fewer safe places to play in poor neighborhoods, which means that poor kids spend more time indoors. And because poor parents often work multiple jobs and odd hours, a lot of this indoor time is spent unsupervised in front of a television screen, oftentimes taking care of younger siblings. If you were to walk around this neighborhood, you'd be hard-pressed to find just normal things like grocery stores with high-quality food. You'd be hard-pressed to find maintained public spaces like parks and libraries. You'd be challenged to find dentist's office or doctor's offices. Just living in this neighborhood can be more dangerous. Poor kids are 6 times more likely to be hit by a car. They're 40% more likely to bump into somebody who's aggressive. And often these aggressive people are in their daycares or in their after-school programs. In poor neighborhoods, violence is commonplace. I cannot forget the little girl who I met last year who told her teacher matter-of-factly during share time, "My uncle got shot last night." And this little girl was in preschool. And once these kids make it safely to school, they often find themselves in an environment that is bewildering, with rules and expectations that are completely foreign to them. Again, let's consider the brain. We ask children with underdeveloped impulse control to wait in line, or wait their turn, or wait to talk. We assume that kids who find it very difficult to shift between working and long-term memory, to recall the learning they did last week, or last month, or even last year. And we're totally shocked as teachers when kids who have learned that resources and affirmation come at a premium struggle to share, to be patient, and to work in groups. Teachers, even the best intentioned teachers, often misunderstand this behavior, seeing it as disrespectful or rude. And indeed, it does look like that. Research tells us that children from poverty often act out, they lack empathy for others, they lack patience, and they act impulsively. Now, any teacher will tell you, if she can't manage classroom behavior, she can't teach anything. But it's important to remember that these behaviors are not necessarily markers of defiance or disrespect. They're just as often symptoms of being raised in the chronic stress of poverty. In his book, Teaching with Poverty in Mind, Dr. Eric Jensen tells us to think about the child's emotional range like a piano keyboard. Now, those emotions in the center are hardwired at birth, so even a baby can demonstrate joy, sadness, disgust, anger, surprise, and fear. But the emotions on the outside have to be taught. And when a family doesn't have the luxury of time, energy, and emotional reserves, these are the skills that often go untaught. And it leaves the child with this really skimpy 6-note emotional range. And again, he'll be disadvantaged because he's not going to be able to come up with the complex emotional responses that are expected in a social setting like a classroom. It's akin to the child playing chopsticks when the expectation is Tchaikovsky. Now, one of the great parts of my job is that I get to talk to a lot of teachers who teach in low-income schools, and one of the things that they tell me is, "Rhonda, our kids don't care about learning." And in a way, they're right. Research tells us that children who suffer from chronic stress are absent 50% more often than their non-stressed peers. So again, let's consider the brain. We know the brain learns best when learning involves continuity and repetition. High absenteeism robs the brain of both. Research tells us that if you suffer chronic stress, you'll be unable to concentrate. Well, concentrating on any one thing is contrary to a brain that has learned that danger or threat can come at any time and from any place. Research says the kids who suffer chronic stress seem less determined. Well, the brain loves pattern, and when the pattern you see over and over is determination, effort, and failure. Determination, effort, and failure. The phrase, "I can't," is actually a reasonably learned logical response. And finally, research shows us that kids who have chronic stress show less creativity. When your daily struggle is hand to mouth, and your reality is inescapable, and your brain's primary function is to keep you safe, being imaginative might be a luxury that brain just can't afford. Now, I know this has not been the most upbeat talk I've ever given. In fact, the stats that I've shared are downright depressing. And so you might be left with this question: is success even possible? And my answer to you is a hopeful, emphatic yes. Yes, success is possible. But success requires that those of us who work with poor kids have compassion and understanding in regard to the extraordinary challenges that they and their families face. Success requires that we pay as much attention to children's social and emotional development as we do their academic. Success requires that we teach kids to recognize and manage their emotions in ways that give them a sense of control and pride. Success requires that our classrooms be warm, welcoming, and truly inclusive. Success requires that our schools become safe community spaces where we work with parents and avoid blaming them. Success requires that we teach, model, and practice social skills that will open the door to worlds beyond the blight and violence of poor neighborhoods. Success requires that teachers, first and foremost, develop genuinely nurturing relationships with every student, not contingent on that student's behavior, but founded on the inherent worth of a child. Success, teachers, requires that our words are consistently kind and encouraging, and that our touch is gentle. Only then are we going to be able to prepare all children for a future that has no place for those who are unprepared. Again, it's all about the brain. Poverty is traumatic, no doubt about it. But we have an opportunity in the school years to rewire brains that have been damaged by stress. I want to leave you with this quote from Dr. Jensen. "The brain that is susceptible to adverse environmental conditions is equally susceptible to positive, enriching effects." Thank you.
All right. My job today is to talk to you about the misdiagnosis of trauma. I've called this trauma in hiding in other iterations of this talk that I've done. What I mean by this is I want you to focus on part of that word, on the miss, because that's what's the important part here. We're missing something. We're mislabeling it. We're making a mistake. We're slapping on, or the kids we work with have had this diagnosis of a mental illness, maybe a learning disability, slapped onto them that might better be explained by what's happened to them or what is happening to them right now. Let me give you a number, because I think it's a staggering one. 1 million. 1 million. That's an estimate of the number of kids each year that are misdiagnosed with a mental illness or a learning disability that might better be explained by that trauma. 1 million. Staggering to me the first time I saw this. But I preface this and buffer it by saying I think I know why it's like this. I look really big right there. We took about 20 shots to try to get a good one of these, and it looks like I have a toothache. The point is that we're stressed professionals, right? We're stressed in our classrooms, in our hospitals, in our clinic. So I think it's really easy for us to get caught up and say, I know what those symptoms look like, and I know how I can best help them. But my challenge today is to look a little bit deeper. We have to take a step back and almost put on our detective hats so that we can take a closer look at this. You know, I think the best example of it is when a kid you're working with has ADHD, right? So you talk to him, her, you talk to the parents, how did this come about? Well, she's had attention problems, so we went to the pediatrician, and I filled out a measure, and they said, you have ADHD and take this meds, and I see them for 15 minutes once a year, and that's that. No, we can do better than that, and I don't think it's just the medical field. I think we're all guilty of allowing ourselves to look like this guy. And teachers, I know your pain as well. My mom is about to enter her 4th decade as a special education teacher in Rochester, New Hampshire, 6th grade. And I would see her come home, and I was this tall, looking a lot like that guy. So I understand, it's prevalent. I think another good way to look at this is I wrote an article earlier this year, what I called 2 Pathways to Misdiagnosis, because I think this can help us understand this problem a little bit better. And I hypothesized that there's 2 of them, an app and adapt pathway. I like things that rhyme. So the app pathway, that's the arousal pathway, and the other side is this dissociative affective pathway. So what I mean by these, the app pathway, these are the kids that are externalizers, right? So they're acting out. So typically they'll get a diagnosis like, say, ADHD, or maybe a behavior problem, learning difference. As opposed to the DAP pathway, that dissociative or affective pathway, these are the kids that tend to turn in on themselves. So they'll come in typically with maybe a depressive diagnosis, anxiety disorder. But they're also what I call the invisible kids, and I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in a minute. But those are the kids that seem like they're doing okay, but maybe they're really quiet, and something in your gut tells you, something might be wrong. But again, I'll give you an example of that in a minute. I'm actually going to tell you 3 stories of kids that I've worked with in the past couple of years. And I'll make it easy. I'm going to talk about 5th, 6th grade-year-old boys, similar in some ways, yet very different in others. But before we get there, keep this quote in mind as we're talking about them, because I really like it. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what's happened to you. So keep that in mind as we go through these 3 stories. So let me tell you about David first. So David's family, again, 5th or 6th grade, I can remember him and mom coming into my office and mom saying, he has ADHD, the school said it's out of control, go get him help. He needs to be on medication, needs to be in therapy, don't send him back until that's happened. And I remember her telling me this very slowly with her head just leaned up on the side of the wall. She was in the very end stages of her own terminal illness. As if that wasn't enough, the family lived in extreme poverty, much like we just heard a minute ago. In fact, he was in 6th grade, but the family had spent each year, he was in a different school each year because mom refused to let him grow up in dangerous places. So as such, they had moved and moved and moved. I started to do some psychological testing with him, and I knew it was more than a problem of just attention when I had him write his name. In 6th grade, he couldn't even write and spell his last name. So, mom, so sick, living in extreme poverty. The fact that he was reading at less than a kindergarten level can look like ADHD. We'll return to his story in a few minutes. Let me introduce to you another child. Let me introduce to you Stanley. So each year, one of the highlights of my year, or maybe the highlight of my year, is that for 1 week each summer, I get to be the psychosocial director of a camp for terminal and chronically ill kids. So a few weeks before we get to camp, the kind of behavior information for kids comes scrolling into my computer. So Stanley's came across, and it basically could have said, watch out for this one. Extreme violence, hitting, acting out, spitting, kicking, kids, adults, everyone, almost to the point where we weren't going to let him come. But we developed what we thought was a solid behavior plan and said, let's give him a chance. And sadly, at camp, we needed to use every bit of it. I can remember having to restrain him every single day. You know, as we had him down, sadly, and saw just the rage, the anger in his eyes, as he started to calm down, you could see that rage and anger turn to sadness and tears. So we thought, we need to look a little bit deeper. What's going on? And slowly but surely it came out that Stanley was being the victim of horrifying abuse from his stepmother back at home. As one example, we noticed he had scars all over his knees. And it came out that one of his punishments was he had to kneel down on tacks and sharp rocks until he was bleeding in order to pay attention or do what he was supposed to be doing and take the medication that he needed to survive. So yes, definitely a behavior problem that needed to be addressed, but so much more. Again, we'll return to him in a few minutes as well. Let me tell you one more story. Let me introduce to you Juan and tell you his story. He's one of those invisible kids that I told you about earlier. Was doing okay, seemed all right. Very quiet, but getting along. But his aunt, not realizing everything he had been through and kind of thinking to herself and getting that gut feeling, he needs to talk to someone, brought him in. And that's kind of when he started telling me his story. It began about 3 summers ago, and he told me his mom made some bad choices and ended up getting deported. His aunt was the only other relative around, so he went to live with her. However, she too had her demons and ended up needing to go to chemical dependency rehab, so he was put into our often broken foster care system. As if that wasn't enough, when Mom was deported, she was pregnant with his soon-to-be little sister. However, during birth, his sister didn't make it and passed away. At that time, his aunt kind of got her act together, and he was sent back to her. And then he talked to me about the worst tragedy of all one day. He said he was playing video games, and the phone rang. His aunt went to answer it, and he remembers her dropping the phone, dropping to her knees, and shrieking. His mom had died of a heart attack, sudden and out of the blue. So one trauma after another, hitting Juan so much, turning him in on himself more and more each time. And we talked one day about why he was so quiet all the time. And I can remember it clear as if it was today, saying to me, sometimes I'm quiet because I'm praying, because I wish I had the strength to take my own life so I could be with my mom in heaven. So yes, quiet, yes, doing okay. But thank God his aunt had the strength to notice that he's been through all these things. I don't understand them, but hopefully I can get him help from somebody that can help him understand it. So I introduce to you these 3 and then say, that's not the right slide, that one. 1 million, right? I told you 3. What about the other 999,997 kids? I'm sure you could tell me stories. I could tell you more. We have to do better at identifying some of these kids. You know, I think we can explain why by telling you a story that I often tell kids when I'm talking to them about trauma. I call it the barbarian versus the painter. So, and I use these to stand for parts of the brain. So the barbarian, he's the guy in charge of the limbic structures like we were talking about, the amygdala, the ones that help us fight when we're angry or traumatized, or run away when we're angry or traumatized. He's in charge of those. The painter, she's more the higher end prefrontal cortex areas of the brain, the ones that help us connect to others. And importantly for our discussion, the ones that help us be successful at school and in life. So if you think about the 3 kids that I just talked about, which one of these guys is totally in charge? That barbarian is raging so much that the painter, she's got no chance at all right now. And taking it a step further, that's kind of the heart of why this is so important and why I wanted to talk about this issue. Because how we address that barbarian really is the treatment. And if our treatment is off, if we're treating a mental condition, a mental illness, a learning disability that isn't getting at the heart of why those symptoms are occurring, then we're completely off and we're not going to be able to get that barbarian in line. And I'll tell kids that the treatment really is the type of food that we give the barbarian. And what's going to fill a barbarian? A potato chip or a nice juicy steak dinner? So if we think about it in terms of our 3 kids, let's return to them. So David, if you remember him, the boy diagnosed with ADHD, mom, so sick, living in virtual homelessness, extreme poverty, the fact that he was illiterate in the 6th grade of school. If we had just put him on stimulant medication, maybe taught him some attention strategies, sure, maybe that's a few chips for his barbarian, but how long before he's raging again? No, so much more was needed to help their family. We needed to make sure mom was getting the hospice and palliative care she needed. The whole family needed therapeutic services to be able to address the grief that was there and that was going to be coming soon as well. We needed to make sure social services was involved so we could get them as stable housing as possible. And we needed to make sure that he got the learning help that he needed so that he was reading above a kindergarten level. That's the steak dinner that his barbarian needed. If we think about Stanley and his family, this is the boy came to camp, such extreme violence, extreme sadness. If we had just kept our behavior plan in place, yeah, he probably could have had a pretty good week at camp. But then that week ends and he goes right back to the horror and abuse that he was living in. No, we needed to do so much more. We needed to make sure that abuse stopped. We needed to make sure that back home, the doctors, the professionals that worked with him knew what was going on so that it could be taken care of and he could get the therapy he needed to get that barbarian in line and start living a better life for himself. And Juan, his barbarian was raging in and not getting any help at all, right? Thankfully, his aunt had the strength to get him the services he needed, because what was needed is so much work to deal with loss after loss after loss. So many losses that some of us might not have to deal with in our whole life, this boy had to deal with by the time he was 11. That was what his barbarian needed. You know, I tell all of these stories not to make us sad. I tell them so that we can honor these children, and that maybe these stories will pop into your head with the kids that you're working with. So you might think, even if I look like that stressed guy at the beginning that looked like he had a toothache, that maybe I can look at the kids I work with and I might be missing something too. I want to end with a couple of quotes. This is the one I heard a couple years ago back in my alma mater of Yale University. Just as chest pains don't always mean heart attack, hyperactivity doesn't always mean ADHD. I'm going to close with my favorite one. And if you remember nothing else from my time with you today, I hope you'll remember this. The label isn't important. What we call it is not important. The cause and what we do about that cause is what's important. And my hope is if we can look a little bit deeper at what might be going on in the kids, in our classrooms, and in our clinics, then maybe we can start to change the odds for some of them. Thank you.
Good job. Thank you, Matt. Sorry. Okay, so my job today is to tell you a little bit about play therapy and complex trauma. What I'd like you to do is think about a child that maybe you've seen misbehave before, or they've done something that you know they shouldn't have done, and you ask them, why did you do that? And you get this response. Everybody knows that look, right? What about, you can tell a child is visibly upset, and you ask them, what's wrong? And you get the same response. All kids know that look. You know, we've all seen that look. So why do kids respond that way? You know, sometimes I think what Rhonda was talking about, you know, when we think these kids are being defiant or manipulative sometimes, when really maybe they just don't know the answer that we're looking for. Or maybe it's because they're operating more out of their right brain that's being more driven by emotion, and is my necklace getting in the way? Huh? Hold, please. We thought this might happen. I apologize. Trying to be fancy. Is that better? Okay. So maybe one of the reasons why they respond this way is because they really don't truly know, you know, the answer. Or the answer that we're looking for, you know. They want to please us, but they don't know what answer it is that we're looking for. Or could it be that they're operating more out of the right side of their brain, which is driven more by emotion, and we're operating more out of our left brain looking for that logical answer? So, you know, a lot of times kids don't have the verbal language just yet or the cognitive ability to give us those answers that we're looking for. So with that said, I would like you to imagine a 4 or 5-year-old who is being raised by their grandparents. Their mother has been diagnosed with a mental illness and is not being medicated. She has ongoing substance abuse. And this child's father is in prison on drug charges. And before they were left, this child was left to be raised by their grandparents. From the time this child was born, they witnessed domestic violence between their parents. This is complex trauma. Now, what I'd like you to do is imagine asking that 4 or 5-year-old, how do you feel about all that? And you might get something like this. You know, I don't even know as adults that we could put into words what we feel about something as complex as that scenario, much less a child, much less a 4, 5, 6-year-old. So then how do children process their trauma? A great colleague of mine gave me this quote. Adults can put their trauma into words. Children put their trauma into play. I think those of us that have been doing play therapy, myself am a play therapist. Those of us that have been doing play therapy, I think, have instinctively been doing what we knew was the right way to communicate with kids, was through play. But it wasn't until recently, with all the brain research that's come out, that kind of tells us a little bit more about why that works so well. If you think about how and where trauma is stored, trauma is a lived experience. We experience trauma through our senses and images. So then doesn't it make sense then that we would start with something that can access that through experientials, through sand tray, through art, through play? Then we can go back and add the verbal language that we need to tell the story. Play is also fun. You know, for these kids that have experienced something so complex and so hurtful and painful, play is still fun. So even though they're in the room working hard on what they've experienced, they're still having fun. So it gives it that safe distance between the trauma. Play is also empowering. These kids have had no control over what's happened to them. But when they get into the play therapy room, they for once can have power and control over something that they had no control over before. Play truly is a child's language, and toys are their words. So in a play therapy room, everything is purposeful and intentional. The toys are selected and displayed about the room so that a child can come in and have access to come and use what they need to tell their story. As a play therapist, I trust that the child's going to take me where they need to go. You know, as a play therapist, my job is also to create an atmosphere of physical and emotional safety. We know that with any modality that we use with kids or with adults and helping them process their trauma, we know that the relationship is key to any intervention that you use. So building that trust and rapport with the child is so very important. My job is also to recognize and reflect this child's feelings about how they're experiencing their trauma, and then also to enlarge the meaning to help facilitate a better understanding of what they've experienced. Let me show you how this can look in the play therapy room with Aaron, who has experienced complex trauma. Aaron is a 5-year-old boy whose mother was murdered. Aaron was referred to me by his kindergarten teacher, who described him as melting down pretty much every day in the classroom. He had shut down, according to his family. His family was telling me they couldn't get him to talk, and so they brought him to play therapy. When Aaron first came into the room, I explained to him, like I do all the kids that come, why he's here. I said, you know, Aaron, sometimes when kids have things happen to them that's made them mad or sad or worried or scared, sometimes they just need an extra special place to play. And so I say, has anything like that ever happened to you that's made you feel any of those feelings? And he immediately said, yes, there's this kid at school that's being really mean to me and it's making me sad. Aaron's not quite ready to tell his story yet. So in the first couple of sessions when he came in, his play looked a lot like it probably did in his classroom. He was aggressive, he was flying toy cars across the room, I was having to set a lot of limits with him. But remember, I trust that the child's going to take me where they need to go. And in the next session, in the third session, he came in and he went over to where the dollhouse is, and he took a female doll figure and he came over to the sand tray that we have, and he buried her in the sand. And then he went over to where the miniatures are and took a couple of tombstones and came over and placed them on top of the sand. And he said, "This is where my mommy is." And I reflected back to him, "I know, your mommy died." Aaron's now ready to tell his story. In the next session, Aaron came in and he went over to the dollhouse and he said, "We got to pack everything up. We got to move." So we spent the whole session packing up all the doll furniture and all the dolls into these toy cars, and we moved them. This is what's happening in Aaron's life. After the loss of his mother, he had to move in with a relative. So as children play, they begin to make meaning out of what they don't understand. They begin to organize their experiences, creating a narrative, telling their story. In the next session, Aaron came in and he went over to where this play phone is and he picked it up and he pretended to have a conversation with his mom. And during the conversation, he said, "Mommy, can I come home now?" And I reflected back to Aaron, "You really miss your mom." Through gradual exposure to something so painful comes tolerance for these children. And now we're able to process the grief and loss and what death and dying means to a 5-year-old. Whereas before, I think if I would have started out that with Aaron, we probably wouldn't have gotten anywhere. So play really is a child's language. Play therapy is also a living relationship. What I mean by that is that children will typically play out with the play therapist what they may be experiencing in other significant adults in their lives. Let me show you how this looked with Emily. Emily came in and announced immediately that I was going to jail. Now, for most of you, this might look like a puppet theater, but for Emily, it was a jail. And in play therapy, the toys can be anything they want them to be. And so for her, she had decided that this was a jail. I spent a lot of time there, but an interesting thing would happen at the end of each session. She would come over and she would want to nurture me, take care of me somehow, feed me, bring me things. When Emily first came to see me, she was brought by her mother and her grandmother. They explained to me that she'd been kicked out of her pre-K classroom. They described her as completely clingy and emotionally dysregulated and acting out quite a bit. They didn't really give me anything else to go on. But as Emily and I continued to play, it kind of became clear to me what she may be experiencing. In the next session, Emily came in and she went over to the sand tray and she was digging in there and she said, "I'm going to fill your heart up with sand and there's nothing you can do about it." Emily's angry, but she's also displaying conflicting feelings and playing that out with me. In the next session, Emily came in, she went over to where the miniatures are and took the snake and the spider and she came over and she said, "They're going to bite you all over and they're going to poison you." But then, in the next half hour of the session, Emily went and got the medical kit where we have real Band-Aids. And she spent 30 minutes putting a Band-Aid on each of the areas where the snake and the spider had bit me. Emily is experiencing an insecure attachment with her mother, which is creating a lot of ambivalence. And she's playing that out with me. It turns out Emily's mom has an undiagnosed mental illness, so she's not being medicated. She has ongoing substance abuse, and she comes in and out of Emily's life. So she may be there for 2 months and have a great relationship with her daughter, only to disappear for 2 weeks, and then that pattern continues. This is creating that push-pull. I love you, I hate you. I want you, but I'm so afraid you're going to leave me, so I need to push you away. That's what Emily is showing me in the play therapy room. How else is a 4 or 5-year-old going to be able to describe with words what that feels like to have that experience to them? But through play, they can tell their story. The Greek philosopher I think said it best when he said, you can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. And how true is that for children? You know, these children that have experienced complex trauma, it can get better. It does get better. You know, through play, they can have some power and control like I talked about. They can be empowered. They can understand a little bit better about what's happening to them. And then we can start to give them coping strategies to learn how to deal with it. We may not be able to change their environment. We may not be able to change their experience of what's going on with them, but we can help them to cope with it and give them the tools that they need to feel better about things. There truly are healing powers in play. And I know this because I witness it almost every day. Thank you.
So why do we share these stories? They're painful. They are difficult to hear. We share them because we have an opportunity to witness their stories. We have an opportunity to witness their journey, the difficult road to recovery. We honor Matt and Karen and Rhonda, and we honor each of you for what you do each day. For if you look around the room, we have 1,400 people. Statistically speaking, many of us grew up in poverty, experienced abuse, or experienced other adverse experiences. I'm one of them. About a year ago, my friend Amy McShane, who is right over here, and I were giving a presentation. We were working in child abuse prevention. We were giving a presentation on the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And we were guiding participants to take the survey, not to share their results, but just to engage them in a different way. We both took the story, and I said out loud, sort of incredulously, I knew my score would be high because of my own childhood, but I said, 9 out of 10. And I love Amy. She's so empathetic. And she leaned over and hugged me and said, it is amazing you made it and you are who you are. Let me be clear, it's not. That's what we're here today to say. It's not. It's not for each of you in this room that went through the same thing. Momentous Institute, our name, what it's about is we cannot lower our expectations of outcomes for children because they grow up in poverty or because they experienced abuse. We have to have expectations of momentous outcomes for all children, irregardless of their background. And then thank you. And then it's our job. We as the adults have to ensure that children who are in trauma can be identified and then guided to help. And so it is tough, but I ask each of you just to put the question mark on next time. Next time something, like Matt said, in your gut, something's not right, put the question mark, is this trauma, and ask for help from a clinician who can help you to unpack what's really going on. Sir Ken, which he's right, go buy all his books, and he's not paying me to say this. Sir Ken's most recent book, Creative Schools, says that one individual truly can make systematic impact or systematic changes, whether the system is a school, a community, or a political system. And then the whole book gives narrative of individuals making a difference. So here's the deal. We have 1,400 individuals in this room. What if we let this wash over us and truly transform what we believe is possible for children, and then inform our practice? I talked about hope at the beginning. That is the living embodiment of hope. we can't instill hope in their hearts until it's instilled in ours. And so I thank you so much for being here with us. I thank you for the work you do every day, and I thank you for having hope with us.